The crisp autumn of 1833 settled over Virginia's Albemarle County with a beauty that seemed almost cruel in its indifference to human suffering. The Blue Ridge Mountains, visible in the distance, framing landscapes of remarkable natural splendor that had witnessed generations of systematic brutality conducted beneath their unchanging peaks. In the slave quarters of Monticello Heights Plantation, situated in the rolling Piedmont country just miles from where Thomas Jefferson had once written words about liberty and equality while holding hundreds of people in bondage, field workers gathered in the evening darkness and spoke in voices that carried both skepticism and something that might have been cautious hope about an extraordinary purchase that had been completed 5 days earlier at the Charlottesville slave market. According to local legend, what had transpired that October morning defied every pattern they had learned to recognize in white families' behavior during their years of observing how slaveholders made decisions about acquiring human property, suggesting possibilities that seemed too improbable to believe yet too specific and detailed to dismiss as mere wishful imagination. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 14 months would become a story preserved not as another tale of suffering endured, but as evidence that resistance could take forms that combined strategic intelligence with moral courage, that unexpected alliances could form between people whom society insisted must remain forever separated by unbridgeable chasms of race and status, and that even within slavery's comprehensive apparatus of control, there existed vulnerabilities that determination and careful planning could exploit when circumstances created opportunities that vigilance and preparation allowed people to recognize and seize. Virginia's Albemarle County in the early 1830s occupied a complicated position in the Commonwealth's moral and economic geography, a region whose soil had been cultivated for tobacco across generations until exhaustion forced diversification to wheat and other less profitable crops, where planter families maintained pretensions to enlightened gentility while depending absolutely on enslaved labor to sustain their declining fortunes, and where proximity to the University of Virginia that Jefferson had founded created intellectual currents that sometimes questioned slavery's morality, even as the institution's economic necessity seemed to preclude any serious consideration of alternatives to the system that sustained the region's agricultural operations. Charlottesville had become the county's commercial and cultural center, with the university bringing periodic influxes of students and faculty whose presence created a veneer of cosmopolitan sophistication that distinguished the town from purely agricultural communities, though this intellectual atmosphere coexisted with slave markets that operated with the same brutal efficiency that characterized such institutions throughout Virginia and the South. The market in Charlottesville served planters from Albemarle and surrounding counties who came to buy and sell human beings when estate settlements, financial pressures, or operational adjustments required modifications to their enslaved labor forces. The institution functioned with rituals designed to reduce complex human lives to simple commercial transactions, with auctioneers cataloging physical capabilities and estimated productive value in language that deliberately obscured the moral horror of treating people as fungible property, whose worth could be calculated through mathematical formulas that assigned dollar values to human muscles and supposedly measured the years of labor that could be extracted before bodies broke under demands that made no allowance for the humanity of those subjected to such calculations. The legal structures governing Virginia slavery in 1833 remained as comprehensive as they had been for generations, with slave codes that forbade literacy, restricted movement, criminalized unsupervised gathering, and created frameworks of control that attempted to make resistance both legally impossible and practically futile, regardless of how desperately people might long for freedom or how intelligently they might search for vulnerabilities in systems that claimed absolute authority. Yet Albemarle County's proximity to mountains and to the complicated borderlands where Virginia met territories with different relationships to slavery created geographic realities that complicated absolute control in ways that flatland plantation regions never experienced. With terrain that offered potential refuge for those desperate or strategic enough to attempt flight, and with populations whose relationship to slavery was more ambiguous than lowland planters found comfortable. Into this world of declining agricultural fortunes masked by intellectual pretensions, of comprehensive legal controls confronting geographic complications, of systematic brutality coexisting with periodic moral discomfort that some white residents felt but rarely acted upon, came two people whose encounter would reveal that even apparently stable marriages could conceal profound disagreements about the fundamental morality of the society they inhabited. and that such disagreements could manifest in actions that violated every expectation about how white women of plantation families were supposed to relate to the enslaved people whose labor sustained their households. Stories passed down through generations claim that the October morning in 1833, when Harrison and Constance Whitmore attended the Charlottesville slave market, began with a conversation that had been occurring with increasing frequency over recent weeks. A discussion about Monticello Heights' financial situation and the decisions that declining tobacco revenues seemed to require. Harrison had concluded that the plantation's continued viability demanded selling several enslaved workers to reduce operating costs and raise capital that could be invested in the diversification to wheat cultivation that economic pressures made increasingly necessary. And he had identified specific individuals whose sale would generate needed revenue while maintaining what his calculations suggested was adequate labor for the estate's modified operations. But Constance had opposed this plan with a persistence that Harrison found both surprising, given her usual deference to his judgment in plantation matters, and increasingly frustrating as her objections prevented him from executing decisions he considered economically essential. She had argued that the sales he proposed would separate families who had lived at Monticello Heights for generations, that surely alternatives existed that didn't require inflicting such pain on people whose labor had sustained the Whitmore family's prosperity across decades, that perhaps they could accept reduced living standards themselves, rather than financing their continued comfort, through the destruction of family bonds among people who had no power to resist such separations. The disagreement had remained unresolved as they traveled to Charlottesville that morning, Harrison intending to complete transactions he viewed as unavoidable economic necessities, while Constance hoped somehow to prevent what she considered morally intolerable actions regardless of their economic justification. According to oral histories, the morning's auction proceeded according to Harrison's plans through its initial stages, with him successfully arranging the sale of 2 field workers, a husband and wife who would be separated because buyers wanted them individually rather than as a unit, for prices that would provide some relief from financial pressures that had been consuming his attention for months. But when the auctioneer brought a man named Cheeky to the block, 7 feet and 7 inches tall, with a physique suggesting tremendous physical strength combined with a bearing that even the degrading rituals of the market couldn't fully suppress, something shifted in the dynamic between Harrison and Constance that would alter not just that day's events, but the trajectory of multiple lives in ways that neither could have anticipated in that moment. Constance had watched the morning's earlier sales with barely concealed anguish that Harrison had noticed, but attributed to feminine sentiment that he assumed would dissipate once she accepted the economic logic of his decisions, and recognized that unpleasant necessities sometimes had to be executed regardless of the temporary emotional distress they caused people whose sensibilities were more delicate than the practical realities that men had to manage. But when she saw Cheeky standing on that platform, when she heard the auctioneer describing him as someone who had been sold 3 times in 5 years because previous owners found him difficult to manage, despite his obvious capacity for heavy labor, when she observed the scars visible on his back even through the shirt he wore and recognized what those marks revealed about the treatment he had endured, Constance made a decision that years of apparently harmonious marriage had given no indication she was capable of making. She turned to Harrison and told him in a voice that carried an authority he had never heard from her regarding plantation business that they would purchase this man, that the money he had just raised through sales that had broken her heart would be used to acquire someone whose description suggested exactly the kind of management challenges that prudent planters normally avoided at all costs. Harrison's response combined shock at what he perceived as his wife's unprecedented presumption to dictate decisions about matters that were properly and exclusively his responsibility, anger at her apparent attempt to undermine choices he had made after careful economic analysis, and genuine bewilderment about what she could possibly hope to accomplish by insisting on such an acquisition that made no rational sense given their financial circumstances. He told her that the suggestion was economically absurd, that they had come to raise money rather than spend it, that purchasing someone described as difficult to manage would create problems their already strained operations couldn't possibly accommodate, that her interference in matters she didn't understand was jeopardizing decisions that their family's survival depended upon him making correctly. But Constance's insistence was unyielding in ways that transcended mere disagreement to communicate that she was acting on convictions she considered more fundamental than his authority, or their economic circumstances, or even the social expectations that normally governed her behavior as a plantation mistress. She told him that if he would not bid, She would find means to make the purchase herself using family resources that her father had settled on her, in ways that Virginia law gave her some control over despite her married status. That this was a line she was drawing about what she would tolerate happening in her name and with her complicity. She made clear that she had acquiesced to the sales that morning that had destroyed a family because she lacked the power to prevent them, but that she would not allow the day to pass without taking some action that honored her own moral convictions, even if that action created complications Harrison would find difficult to manage, and even if he never understood or forgave her insistence on this matter. Faced with what amounted to an ultimatum delivered in tones that suggested profound moral conviction rather than temporary emotional excess, and acutely aware that other planters were observing this unprecedented public disagreement between husband and wife over matters that custom and law decreed belonged exclusively to male authority, Harrison bid on Chike with mounting resentment, but also with a kind of wary recognition that his wife of 18 years was revealing aspects of her character and convictions that their marriage had somehow never fully brought into view. He competed against two other bidders who recognized Cheek's value for the heaviest plantation labor, despite the warnings about management difficulties, and he finally secured him for $1,800, a sum that consumed most of what he had raised through the morning's earlier sales, and that left him with minimal net benefit from transactions that had cost him enormous emotional effort to execute. As they completed the purchase and arranged for Cheeky to be transported to Monticello Heights, Harrison demanded explanations for behavior he found both incomprehensible and deeply threatening to his understanding of how their household functioned and how his authority over plantation matters was supposed to operate. But Constance declined to provide details that would satisfy his questions, speaking instead about moral obligations and Christian duties in language so general that it seemed deliberately calculated to avoid revealing whatever specific purposes motivated her unprecedented insistence. What Harrison did not know, what Constance's careful discretion across many years had successfully concealed from him, was that his wife had been conducting a quiet campaign of resistance against slavery's brutalities that manifested in ways he never noticed, because he assumed her household management decisions reflected the same economic calculations that governed his own thinking rather than moral convictions that would have alarmed him profoundly had he understood their true nature and radical extent. Constance had grown up in a Quaker family that had migrated to Virginia from Pennsylvania 2 generations earlier, bringing religious convictions about human equality and the sinfulness of slavery that sat uncomfortably alongside the economic realities that made prosperous life in Virginia dependent on enslaved labor. Her family had gradually accommodated to Virginia society in ways that required suppressing, or at least not acting upon, their anti-slavery convictions, creating a kind of moral compartmentalization that allowed them to maintain Quaker identity while participating in economic systems that their religious principles suggested they should oppose. When Constance married Harrison and became mistress of Monticello Heights, she had initially hoped that she might influence him toward more humane treatment of enslaved workers. That daily proximity and her gentle persuasion might soften whatever abstract justifications allowed him to maintain the system with apparent moral comfort. But she had gradually recognized that Harrison's commitment to slavery transcended simple economic interest to reflect deeply internalized beliefs about racial hierarchy and the naturalness of black servitude that made him genuinely unable to see enslaved people as fully human in ways that created moral obligations comparable to those owed to white people. This recognition had led Constance to begin taking actions she could never acknowledge to her husband. Using her authority over household operations and her relationships with enslaved women who worked in close proximity to her to create small spaces of relative safety that mitigated slavery's worst effects without directly challenging Harrison's ultimate control. She taught household servants to read despite laws forbidding literacy, understanding that education represented a form of power that circumstances might someday make valuable for those who possessed it. She maintained careful contacts with Quaker families in Charlottesville and in the surrounding county, whose continuing commitment to anti-slavery principles made them sympathetic to providing assistance even when social and economic pressures prevented open opposition to the institution. Most significantly, Constance had been studying escape routes and learning about networks that assisted fugitives toward freedom, accumulating knowledge and contacts that she had no immediate plan to use but that she recognized might prove crucial if circumstances ever created opportunities to help someone reach liberty. When she saw Cheek on that auction block, when she heard the auctioneer's descriptions of his history of being sold repeatedly because owners couldn't break his spirit, When she observed the intelligence in his eyes that suggested active assessment even in that moment of extreme vulnerability, Constance recognized someone whose repeated resistance to total subjection had marked him for eventual destruction through sale to the Deep South's brutal cotton or sugar operations, where life expectancy was measured in years and where any hope of survival with dignity intact would be eliminated. In that moment of recognition, Constance made a decision she had been moving toward for years without fully acknowledging even to herself, that she would use whatever resources and influence her position provided to help this man not just survive but escape to freedom. Regardless of the risks such assistance would create for her own security, and regardless of how her husband would react if he ever discovered what she was actually doing. Cheeky arrived at Monticello Heights on an October evening when the autumn air carried the first real cold of approaching winter, and when the plantation's rhythms were settling into patterns that would govern operations through the coming months. Harrison assigned him immediately to the most demanding field labor, clearing new ground for wheat cultivation, moving massive rocks and stumps that would require teams of normal-sized workers to handle, breaking soil too compacted for standard plowing. The work was brutal by design, Harrison believing that establishing dominance over new acquisitions required demonstrating immediately that their size or history of resistance offered no protection from the total authority that ownership conveyed, and that the sooner they accepted the futility of resistance, the more smoothly plantation operations would function. But what Harrison did not observe, what the plantation's daily routines made invisible to him as he focused on managing declining revenues and persistent debts, was that Constance began finding ways to communicate with Cheeky that appeared entirely routine from external observation, but that actually served purposes her husband would have found both incomprehensible and intolerable had he understood what was occurring. She would bring food and water to field workers during the day, a practice that Harrison viewed as appropriate concern for maintaining valuable property, but that gave Constance brief opportunities to speak with Chike, in contexts where conversations could be disguised as simple instructions or inquiries about his adjustment to plantation routines. She assigned him to maintenance work on various outbuildings and equipment, tasks that his strength made him well suited for, but that also placed him in locations where slightly longer exchanges could occur, without attracting attention from overseers or other enslaved workers who might feel obligated to report unusual interactions between the mistress and a field worker. Most crucially, she arranged for him to have responsibilities that required occasional travel to Charlottesville for supplies or equipment repairs, journeys that Harrison viewed as efficient use of someone whose size made him capable of transporting heavy loads, but that actually served Constance's purposes by giving Chike knowledge of roads and contacts in town that could prove essential if escape ever became possible. Through these carefully orchestrated interactions, Constance communicated information that Cheeky received with profound wariness, born from years of experiencing white people's capacity for manipulation and betrayal, even when they presented themselves as sympathetic or helpful. She told him that she opposed slavery on moral grounds despite her position as plantation mistress, that she maintained contacts through Quaker networks who could provide assistance to those seeking freedom, that she would help him escape when circumstances made such assistance feasible without creating suspicions that would endanger everyone involved. Cheeky listened to these communications while maintaining careful skepticism, understanding that some slaveholders used false promises of assistance to identify those contemplating resistance, so that brutal examples could be made that would discourage others from similar thoughts. But he also recognized that his circumstances at Monticello Heights might never again provide opportunities like those Constance seemed to be offering, and that refusing potential assistance because it seemed implausible might be the kind of excessive caution that kept people enslaved when freedom could be achieved through calculated risk-taking. The winter of 1833 and spring of 1834 brought a period of careful mutual assessment, during which Constance worked to demonstrate to Cheeky that her assistance was genuine, while he simultaneously tested the authenticity of her claims through small acts that could reveal whether she would report resistance to Harrison or whether her opposition to slavery was substantial enough to withstand the pressures that exposure would create. Constance began providing specific and detailed information about routes north toward Pennsylvania, explaining the locations of Quaker families and free Black communities who might offer assistance, sharing knowledge about patrol patterns and surveillance techniques that could help someone avoid detection during the most dangerous early stages of flight, when proximity to the plantation made recapture most likely. She gave him access to maps and written materials that helped him understand the complex geography between Albemarle County and Free Territory, resources that her position and education allowed her to possess, but that would result in severe punishment for any enslaved person discovered with such documents. Most significantly, Constance began accumulating concrete resources that would be necessary for successful escape: preserved food that could sustain someone through weeks of careful travel, clothing appropriate for varied terrain and weather conditions, and most crucially, forged papers identifying Cheeky as a free black man named Charles Williams traveling on legitimate business. Documents that she obtained through Quaker contacts in Charlottesville, who took enormous personal risks to assist those seeking freedom, and who operated with the kind of careful coordination that made their assistance effective, despite the legal dangers their activities involved. Bakari, observing these preparations while testing Constance's sincerity through small acts of resistance that could reveal whether she would report him to Harrison, gradually came to believe that her opposition to slavery was authentic, and that her assistance represented genuine possibilities for freedom, despite the formidable obstacles that any escape attempt would necessarily involve. By summer of 1834, the careful preparations that Constance and Cheeky had maintained for months began moving toward actual implementation, as circumstances created an opportunity that careful planning had positioned them to exploit when it materialized. Harrison needed to travel to Richmond for extended negotiations with merchants and creditors about tobacco sales and debt restructuring, business that would require at least 2 weeks away from Monticello Heights, and that would leave Constance in practical control of the plantation's daily operations. She communicated to Cheek through their established methods that he should prepare to attempt escape during this window, that she would create the specific conditions necessary for departure, but that precise timing would depend on variables that neither could completely predict or control in advance. The plan they developed involved Cheek leaving on what would appear to be a routine journey to Charlottesville to collect supplies and equipment that Constance had ordered for plantation operations, a task he had performed several times before and that would not immediately raise suspicions when he failed to return within expected timeframes. But instead of returning to Monticello Heights after reaching Charlottesville, he would continue north using routes Constance had mapped in considerable detail, carrying the forged papers that identified him as Charles Williams, and money she had provided that would allow him to purchase passage on stages or boats that could accelerate his journey toward Pennsylvania. The opportunity came in July 1834, during the week after Harrison departed for Richmond, and when weather conditions seemed favorable for extended travel before late summer heat made such passage more difficult and dangerous. Constance sent Cheek to Charlottesville with a carefully prepared list of supplies to purchase, and with a wagon that ostensibly would be needed to transport those materials back to the plantation. But she also provided him with the forged papers, with money sufficient to sustain him through weeks of careful travel, and with detailed written instructions about specific contacts he should seek in Charlottesville, and at intervals along the route north, who could provide further assistance and guidance toward safe passage into Pennsylvania. Their final conversation before his departure, as preserved in oral traditions maintained by the networks that assisted his flight, acknowledged both the gratitude he felt for assistance he had never expected from someone in her position, and the recognition that she was taking profound risks that could destroy her marriage and social standing if her role in his escape were discovered by her husband or by the broader community, whose approval she needed to maintain her position. Cheek left Monticello Heights on a July morning when summer heat was already building, but when the day promised to be manageable for someone undertaking what was ostensibly a routine journey to Charlottesville and back. He traveled to town as instructed, made selective purchases to establish the appearance of legitimate business, then quietly met with Quaker contacts Constance had arranged who provided him with additional resources and guidance before he abandoned the wagon at a predetermined location and continued north on foot and occasionally by hired transport, using the forged papers to deflect questions about his right to travel and relying on the network Constance had connected him to for assistance at critical junctures along the route toward Pennsylvania. The journey from Albemarle County to Free Territory required weeks of extraordinarily careful travel through a landscape where slave patrols operated with legal authority and financial incentives to capture fugitives, where any black person's presence without proper documentation could result in arrest and sale regardless of actual legal status, and where the proximity to mountains offered both potential concealment and dangers from terrain that could kill the unprepared. According to fragmentary accounts preserved in oral histories maintained by Quaker networks and free black communities who assisted fugitives, Cheeky successfully navigated these challenges through a combination of Constance's meticulous preparation, his own intelligence and resourcefulness developed through years of resisting various owners' attempts to break his spirit, and assistance from people who took enormous risks to help those seeking freedom despite the severe legal penalties their activities invited. By August 1834, Cheeky had reached Pennsylvania and was making his way toward the established free Black communities in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, where he could receive support for creating new identity under the name Charles Williams and finding employment that would allow him to sustain himself in freedom. What happened to him after reaching free territory remains largely undocumented, as survival required that fugitives maintain careful discretion about their origins and the circumstances of their escape to avoid providing information that could be used for recapture or that might endanger those who had assisted their flight. Some accounts suggest he eventually made his way to Canada, recognizing that even free states offered imperfect protection against kidnapping by slave catchers who operated with minimal legal constraint. While others claim he remained in Pennsylvania, where he established himself successfully under his assumed identity and may have participated in assisting other fugitives along routes he had traveled. Back at Monticello Heights, Constance managed the aftermath of Cheek's disappearance with a performance she had carefully prepared during the months of planning that had preceded his escape. Expressing initial surprise when he failed to return from Charlottesville within expected timeframes, and suggesting various explanations ranging from accident to illness to simple flight that she claimed to find puzzling, given that he had seemed to be adjusting reasonably well to plantation routines. When Harrison returned from Richmond to discover that the acquisition his wife had insisted upon barely 9 months earlier had vanished, his anger was complicated by multiple factors: the financial loss the disappearance represented, the way Constance's insistence on the purchase now seemed even more incomprehensible, and the reality that his own absence had created conditions that made escape possible in ways that complicated any attempt to assign blame exclusively to his wife's management of plantation operations during his time away. He organized searches and offered rewards, contacted slave catchers, and placed advertisements in newspapers describing Cheek's distinctive height and offering payment for information leading to his recovery. But the trail had gone cold with a completeness that suggested either remarkable luck or assistance that professional pursuers found difficult to counter, even with their considerable experience tracking fugitives through terrain they knew intimately. Whether Harrison ever developed serious suspicions about Constance's role in Cheek's escape remains uncertain from the fragmentary evidence that survived. If doubts emerged, he never voiced them in ways that created documented confrontations, perhaps because accusing his wife would require acknowledging possibilities about her convictions and actions that would fundamentally destabilize their marriage and his understanding of the household he believed he controlled. Or perhaps because on some level he preferred not knowing details that would force him to take actions against his own wife, that social expectations and personal pride would make unavoidable if her betrayal became undeniable. Constance maintained careful discretion about her involvement for the remainder of her life. Understanding that revelation could endanger both herself and others who had participated in the networks that assisted Cheeky's escape, and that continued to help other fugitives despite the legal dangers such assistance involved. The financial loss from Cheeky's disappearance combined with other economic pressures eventually forced Harrison to make more dramatic adjustments to Monticello Heights operations. Though the extent to which these changes reflected purely economic necessity versus any shifts in his thinking about slavery's sustainability or morality remains unclear from available documentation. The impact of Cheek's escape rippled through enslaved communities and anti-slavery networks in ways that official records never captured, but that oral traditions preserved across generations as evidence that freedom remained achievable even when circumstances seemed hopeless. For enslaved people in Albemarle County, the story of someone so physically distinctive successfully escaping, despite every apparent disadvantage, became proof that careful planning combined with unexpected assistance could overcome surveillance and control mechanisms that appeared comprehensive. That the system's claims about the impossibility of escape and the futility of resistance were lies that served to maintain psychological control, but that did not reflect actual realities about what determined and intelligent people could achieve when opportunities materialized. For the Quaker networks and other anti-slavery groups that assisted fugitives, Cheek's escape demonstrated once again the crucial importance of allies within slaveholding households, people whose positions gave them access to resources and information that could transform possibilities for successful flight from theoretical to practical. Constance's role, though it could never be publicly acknowledged during her lifetime in Virginia, without creating catastrophic consequences, became known among those who coordinated assistance to fugitives, encouraging others who opposed slavery on moral grounds to consider how they might use whatever resources their positions provided to actively subvert the institution, rather than simply deploring it privately while doing nothing to assist those seeking freedom. The deeper truth that emerges from Chake and Constance's story transcends the specific details of one escape from one Virginia plantation in 1834 to reveal essential insights about moral courage. The nature of resistance within oppressive systems, and the complex ways that individuals navigated between social expectations and personal convictions when those elements came into profound conflict. Their experience demonstrates that slavery, despite its comprehensive legal structures and systematic violence, could never achieve the total control that its ideology claimed, that the system fundamentally depended on cooperation from people whose conscience or calculation might lead them toward subversion rather than enforcement, when circumstances forced them to choose between complicity and resistance. And sometimes, according to the legends that communities preserved when official history tried to erase them, that resistance stood 7 feet 7 inches tall, purchased at a wife's insistence not to be exploited but to be saved. Assisted by a plantation mistress whose Quaker-influenced convictions led her to violate every expectation of her position, and whose meticulous planning and strategic courage created possibilities that the system insisted could never exist. Cheek's journey from Charlottesville's auction block to freedom in Pennsylvania lasted barely 9 months from purchase to escape. But his story became part of the traditions through which enslaved communities preserved both hope and practical knowledge about resistance. Proof that freedom was achievable through intelligence and courage and unexpected alliance, that moral conviction could lead people to risk everything they possessed to help others escape bondage, and that human dignity and the yearning for liberty could never be fully suppressed regardless of how comprehensive the apparatus of oppression or how absolute the claims of those who benefited from the systematic exploitation of their fellow human beings.